This is book one of the Fall of Splendor, my story, The Fall of Splendor. And the title of book one is Like a Tree Planted by Rivers of Water. My name is William E. Knight. I'm the real William E. Knight, the original, the first one. It's a pen name I created. My name is Bruce Jason Creech, BJC, just like believe in Jesus Christ, because I believe in Jesus Christ. And my story is about the way of a man with a maid. This is chapter 1. Chapter 1 is titled, Like a Tree Planted by the Rivers of Water. From the men of old, which have their portion in this life, who hath disposed the whole world. Long ago, before the world that is was, before the fountains of the deep were broken up and the continents divagated, before only one moon rose alone upon the hour of gloaming, before even time was measured by day and night, aye, long ago, how different the world was. Reposed upon its special bed of youth, the earth toiled not, neither did it spin. All the heavens lay somnolent in both solar motion and eternal reach. To and fro, all the world laid still from sea to sea. 'Twas in this initial state of universe that the souls of men first arose to know beauty and love and begin that long, long journey which is everlasting. For the spirit will endure when the body has perished. Alas, the memory of such days has become all but lost to the men of this age. Such days lay not even as shadows, with vague redolence in morning's wake. Thus it is of the lives of men which are fragile in their eternal worth. How few there are whose souls indeed have stirred in such simplicity and sincerity as to behold these truths. Behold, if a quiet word or verse by verse should reveal the power to touch the heart, then man would surely remember the song of Aradia, for there is redemption in remembrance. If one should take care to walk the edge of the wood in the quiet hours of twilight, the sound, the subtle song of memories, deep and furtive as the roots of the world, can be heard whispering of a time when both elves and men, and even fae, those creatures of purest magic and mirth, roamed with gleeful eyes beneath the sky, and more than dared to dream, but romanced the world with righteousness. For such were men of old in those days, that they called upon the name of the one who 'twas as the image of jealousy. In those days, the world that now is was not, and the world that was called Elfand. If one looks to a map of those days, he will see that in the far north and in the east, but not so far as to be upon the very shores of the Sea of Sylvanar, lay a wide realm of mountain, wood, and lealet. In these regions did elves and fairies dwell, though it is that fairies dwell in both the east and west. But it is the lay of Lorne, and the outer laying provinces around it where the dark elves dwell. This is where our journey must begin. But what exactly are elves? And what do elves do? Why, they are shepherds of the forest, guardians of trees and the nurturers of their saplings, not altogether unlike Ents or Dryads, save that they are men, but immortal in their youth. For youth is most precious. It is youth that men, in their ignorance, so oft do waste, as though time 'twas not wont to cast its care upon a soul. The elves tend the gardens of woodlands, grooming both bark and bower, and speaking with those gentle beings as a man might speak to his friend. Yet they have not been appointed arduous tasks, in that Trees are obsequious beings to all the world, and by nature need they little fawning. Nay, theirs is a great work, with much patience and care, with the long suffering of a predestination, such as could only befit earthen giants, whose trophic roots do not weather the soil, but rather hold the world in its place. And they stand watch. Let the field be joyful, and all that is therein. Then shall all the trees of the wood rejoice. For the world is joyful, in that the elves have tended the woods. By their magic do men find air to breathe, and fill their lungs with the spirit of life, which without whom could there be no life, and without which the terrible void of beauty should cover the world. Then would not men be as but creatures of the sea, a shadeless vault of insipid lands, barren of bark and bower, and dolorous for lack of their furtive powers. Such is the magic of trees, and the elves understood these things. Hear now the sound of trees as the elves hear them. They are silent, yet they are not statues. They move, and yet they stand, planted in their contrasts of candid hue, bark and leaf whispering, wanting not, yet desiring with reach of bower to cast their shadows upon the world, and in such motion speak their comfort and consolations of grace. So Verdesque, are these spirits? They are not stone, yet they are not flesh. So immortal as the elves they seem, for they endure both in beauty and subtle change against time, when time cannot endure against itself. For men will cast an eye and say, Behold, see this green, how these leaves express themselves, so simply, in veins of honesty, as only nature can be honest. For when hath nature yet left its natural use? This is the sound of trees, the quiet speaking to the soul of man by simply standing still betwixt the earth and sky, and sharing life. Aye, man has passed by and breathed the breath exhaled of trees, and yet the trees have stood silent still, unnoticed. Yet they never hate. Lee of Lentar and Lay of Lorn, those vastest of elfin woodland realms, merged on the northmost roots of the thundering hills, hills which, in those days, echoed neither rumor nor filford whisper of orc. Rather were they dressed and decked with tree and flower unscathed, unhewn, and thus the elves named these mountains the Lathro Hills, hills which were, in truth, merely the northernmost fingers of the wayward god. The voice of elfin maiden lingered ever upon the rills, and down low in the valleys of this region the hills were filled with laughter. Well indeed did the Lathro Hills echo words softly spoken, to ring them out in a chorus of song and poetry. Well did those valleys echo the hymns of Vaifilop, and the flute of Imagil 'twas ever the sweetest of those choruses. Lorn 'tis an airy wood, its vast folds and grove of willow, elm, birch, and oak were trees of broad stature, whose trunks rose haughtily into the sky. Of the trees of Lorn the oaks held dominion, and though Lorn's bowers were yet broad, covering all, the forest bed spread beneath, a wide space of tall, green lea flowers, of which blues, yellows, and oranges favored most the petals which decked the lee-forced soil, amongst whom the favorites of Lorn's queen were the gowans, and the asphodels, and the violet lilies, and the water lilies of the river Dawn, and all such delicate things whose hue were turquoise. Often then would the maidens gather those precious flowers and weave them into crowns and headdresses for the queen to wear when she danced through the stoneless streets of their kingdom in parades and days of festivity. Of course, there was rarely a day without festivity, and rarely a day in which the Queen of Lorn, nor her whole troop of maidens, could not be found upon the banks of the river Dawn, parading up and down it. Now the Dawn is indeed a mighty river, running at nigh the breadth of all Lorn. The Eressa is but a child of it, and its waters are pristine and sweet, almost twinkling like transparent sheets of ice beneath a star-clustered sky, ever freshly drawn from the mount or from the fountains of Vain and Ur, which rises to form the northmost tips of the mountains of the Newell Lunlas. Often have the unicorns drank and bathed upon its banks, for its current is gentle and filled with the songs of shallow falls, and it was to them a beloved stream, and a cherished greatly in their eyes. There was not a river in all the world which held such favor to those faring, save that of the Esgarra, for its lute was first conceived in the mind of Erdanas, howbeit Angwil played a part in that strand. Whom has heard the call of ease and careless duty like streams, which having no want have passed o'er polished stones of moss, and days that will not die, when time is caught in webs of green and leaf, so that it passeth not? Such is becoming of elfin lands, and thus is the lay of Lorn, afore even upon the days of this Spilnas. Therefore it came to be that as the kingdom paradise of Lorn flourished, and was increased in riches beyond measure, the dark elves built for Eudorus their king and Elfand their queen, and for their children, and for their children's children, a great city, a place and a palace in the heart of that wood, where they might gather and might dwell, a home for when their hearts weary of carefree carousing. Oh, carefree carousing, careful for nothing, yet careful in everything, casting all care in the wisdom of joy and rejoicing. They named their dwelling Mythilion, so ever was it called Mythilion, the fair city of Lorn. Here they dwelt beneath lightly thatched roofs of bark and house and hamlet and homestead, where the air was clearest and the wind often a sweet and gentle whistle. For those elves loved the shadow of the forest and the sound of the world, which echoed near the roots of the trees, namely the oak. Many were the winged creatures which perched and found home to nestle there among the elves, and delight in the melody of that people's speech, for they were fair-tongued and good-hearted. How is it that such a folk and city of elves hath endured beyond long and mournful ages, when the powers of Gothulian grew cruel and fierce, and more nobler of their fellows didst fall, with kingdoms and hearts broken and lost? To endure were trees planted by rivers of water, a city set on a hill, a dell of wood whose leaves have prospered in silent peace, though none could tell. Ere thus have many of the wood elves strived to imitate the glory of Mythilion. And namely in the dark days of these latter times, for its natural design was surely a safe haven from the four-footed and prowling servants of Minra, and even more dastardly things which walked awry. Ere since the love of Eudorus and Elfand has shone upon this world, did not Dainstill, that great shepherd of old, tend with sleepless care the trees of Lorn, insomuch that they sprouted, unmeasured indeed, as aforesaid, like a tree planted by rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season, and whose leaf shall not wither. Thus stands the city of Mythilion, for Arania knoweth the way of the righteous. Oh, how lovely are thy oaks, O Lord! Stand, stand, they shall not be moved, from generation to generation, and all the leaves of verdance, where the bowers hung both low to touch the forest bed, and reaching to the upward uttermost airs, the wood should seem to be a fortress of nature's verdant liberties, though yet the willow and the willow elm that surely have bowers bent lower upon the ground, these, however, are a rarer tree in that wood. Still many of those whose trunks stretch as tall as all the rest of that great wood, and seem to be a more precious ornament, hold no less a loveliness. For a tree, a solitary tree, has its own dominion, its own vast realm which exists within its bowers cast. To each tree, as to each star, there is a glory from one, differeth from another in glory, and so too doth one tree differeth from another. For one glory is heavenly, and another is terrestrial. What then of trees and stars? They are twain somehow, furtively in their immeasurable leagues apart, watching one another in the world, and to the glory of trees, whom stand so stolidly, a grove, a world together gives both fashion and grace to nature's character, and thusly in dominion, a majesty and grace given to elves and to men. Mayhap it was the magic of Daneville, or as some have supposed, one of the lost Avar, which kept that wood safe. So many oak, so great a grove, to stand amongst them, one might then know the mystery of their enduring beauty. Now of the willow, elm, birch, and oak, which grew amongst the woods of the Lord, were not the oak and birch the mightiest of these? The shepherd of those woods held these in highest favor, and namely the oak, for among them were his saplings named. However, in the depths of Lorne grew a thick grove of white and silver birch, though the stature of these trees was much less than the great oaks of Alzengraff. Their roots were deep, and their bowers of a lengthy breadth. These trees stood as towers, whose crowns reached toward the sun, and in the long hours of the day their shadows ran the length of the outlying hills. The bark of their trunks ran smooth as stone finely polished, and their leaves shimmered brightly in the twilight. All who came to behold this copse would say, Gemoaveth Elufanuo, which is to say, Behold the halls of the blessed. For their glory was not hidden. Here Eudorus pleased to dwell. These birches rooted beside a child of the dawn. This river did Eudorus bid his wife to name, and Elafil called it Nadilian, for the joy of Nagand was reflected in its diminutive cascades. Thus the sylph pleased to linger nearby. Eudorus, however, often longed to dwell where he may yet gaze upon the stars and listen to their voices as he had afore in those days when in those days upon the shores of Illuvius. Here it was amidst this grove of birch, whose towered trunks of white overwhelmed the statue of the oaks, that Eudorus would perch upon its bowers, and be lifted up between the earth and the heaven, to behold the sky unhidden by leaf and broken by bower. Here the buds bloomed long like rays from fountains, yet they were thick and soft like clouds, but strong as mountain stone. These birch thus were named Mythilian, and here Eudorus and his sylvan bride Elafil carved the halls of Glen Twaloth. O elvish halls of silver birch, to stand Titanus above all Lord! No oak nor elm shouldst thus compare. A city marked not by walls nor roads, but rather the arching bowers. Such quiescent turbulence of beauty, 'tis the natural way of trees in fellowship, one with another. A nurtured hall, a courtyard, choir lofts, and a great throne of royal elfinhood, with splendor like to gemstones, yet only made of wood. Here Eudorus cast his dominion as king of the dark elves. For dominion is to a king an ointment which all precious things as silver and gold and spices, and houses of armor and houses of treasure cannot increase. There is neither salve nor perfume, there is neither praise nor blotting, which shall console a goodly king, as to know that his dominion is one of righteousness and truth and meekness. Thus in the building of Glen Twoloth, remembered Eudorus well the secrets of the honeydew halls, and the simple pleasures of those southeastern woods of tall, spicy pines, which Burl Branch long ago tended, even in the days when Fay no longer dwelt in the east, insomuch that its presence seemed as but a shadow and an outline of the trees. The great courtyard of Glen Twoloth, which the dark elves built, met the forest below through a series of elegantly winding stairs, ornately carved and inlaid with wreaths of silver and wreaths of white and purple flowers. Rails woven of vines strong as iron girded the stairways. Bells brought they from Narn, of silver and of crystal, and many great bells yet of jasper and coral from the shores of Elfand, gifts from the kingdoms of Varnos, and yet even fine and thinly sculpted glass from the golden shores of Lufan, which were borne across the waters of Mirth and Lugnium, and over the great bridge of Amenvreth. For in the days of Visvalnas was not Ozengroth still a mighty wood? These hung upon the rails of the stairways and bowers of the court, and all the banisters thereof, so that whene'er the wind blew, there was much music. The courtyard of Glen Twoloth lay broad and long. It ran the length of 5,000 paces, insomuch that a great host, tens of thousands, could stand within the court and before the choir of Lorn which did encircle it. Many lofts were built therein to house the musicians and bards. Hence did great laud ever fill those halls, yet no roof save the sky covered it. For the bowers of the great birches veiled, if desired, its guests from rain shouldst it fall. The wealth, the grace, and the splendor of Glen Twoloth were exceedingly great. Many gifts and treasures are brought there, and of all the lays of Mithlerian Vold, not even the halls of the gnomes rival the splendor of the halls of the dark elves, Glen Twoloth. A great dais stood upon the north end. There would the high esteemed and most renowned of the elven houses and noble guests from afar find seats of honor. Oftentimes a great gathering would they make, a feast of majesties amongst that place, the kind of majesty which only those who keep a furtive understanding, not of stone, but of nature's crowned redress, could craft and thus express. Verdantly soft, verdesquely shimmering, 1,000 hues of green, a perfection of green both in light and in shadow, mingled with the walnut white of nacreous smooth trunks. The birchen walls expressed the echo of the stars as though tapered and burning with cruel jealousy. In the midst of the dais on the north end, the dark elves placed a throne. The throne 'twas the image of Eudorus' dominion as king. For a throne to a king is both a place of rest and toil. There he shall sit and muse and with time, and there he shall sit and gaze with discerning eyes upon his fellow kinsmen. A throne to a king is both an ornament and a silent converse to those over which he hath dominion. For they come and stand before him and behold his majesty where he sits. If he should rise, they all. If he should refrain, they all still. Yet a righteous king will not demand their marvel. Rather, his grace will draw it from them freely, thrones for both lord and queen, set in the midst thereof, of all that hall, carved by the hands of elfin artisans, from fine wood, even the wood of white cedars and cherry bark oaks, and yet the thrones remained bare, bereft of jewels of silver, and any fine stone, that their grace be not hid. So absolute was the craftsmanship thereof. Thus, if one should stand in that hall, and look onward, beholding the king of the dark elves upon his throne, one would see an image, a world whose courted heights glistered faintly with the midst of starlight, and against which veiled the birchen walls raked softly upward in the stillest motion of trees. A strange thing it might seem to behold such a broad pavilion so dimly lit, and still bright with the opalescent candor of open atmosphere. For in such a place of carefully balanced light, the king cast his shadow from his gnarled wooden throne, as one might cast his thoughts and cares, with hand gracefully beneath his chin. But for all the blessed nature of that woodland, and for all the verdant riches of that city, and the exceeding glory of Glim-Twalath, the beauty of Elfand, and the skill of her harp and song, far exceeded the treasures and the grandeur of those elfin halls, and even far exceeded the shadow of the east, when he cast himself in thought, shadow of the king. All who came as guests to feast and dine and make merry in Mythilium gave tell of the glory and the grandeur of that place. Yet when words of praise and extolation ceased, the tongues of all whomsoever spoke thenceforward gave greater adulation, not to the treasure, neither laden thereof, nor fashioned within those halls by the hands of the king's artisans, but their voices harped much concerning that sylvan queen Elfand. For was she not a sylvan queen of old, from the realms of Mythilian bold, whence cometh all the nymphs? 'Tis said of those fairy damsels, are not even the modest among them fair, like queens among the elves? And even those esteemed plain of face, like goddesses among the maidens of men. And among them surely Elfand was fairest of all, for she was queen among them, and how much more so queen among the elves of that wood. As surely as the brides of the kings of the Eldar wore stars upon their brows, that they might shine forth in radiance to pierce the eyes of men, starless, but with the lilies of the dawn for a coronet, the beauty and grace of that queen illuminated her presence, as she sat thus upon her throne, poised like the petals of a white rose, or walking beneath the bowers of the white birch, below the moon's thrice-fold rays. Did she not seem as Samar, when Ongwil's tender hand hath first stirred the ear? Thus, in those days, the beauty of Elfand became the fame of those woods, and beyond, and the music of her golden harp, the perpetual sincerity of desire among both those whom dwelt in Lorne and all whom were its guests. Much can be said concerning the wealth, the grace, and the splendor of Glim-Twalath, for they were exceedingly great. As aforesaid, innumerable gifts and treasures were brought there by the countless guests of that grand court, namely the fairy of Mythilian, and not a few of Nar. The courts of Glim-Twalath welcomed all from woodland realm and league, sprites and fays from as far east as Loreless, and yet even from Ilos in the west. And all who came brought gifts and tokens of fame and favor to the king of those woods, so that since those days of a truth, the world has not seen nor heard of such a calamity in riches bestowed. During that age of shadowless hours, even the gnomes of the great hills came bearing precious stones and other treasures of the mountains. From kingdoms afar, From kingdoms far and fabled they came, Vain and Ur in the distant regions of the south, Fond-du-Land and Mithridat. They came, ears overburdened with the fame of the beauty of that silken queen. So they longed to behold her face to face, in the softness of her radiance, and with itching ears descry the harmony of her golden harp. Of a truth, no chord strummed has been more alluring to the souls of men than those spells which the sirens of the seas have cast upon the wayward sailor. Thus, with their gifts shewed they favor upon favor, and their treasures and artifices were of much renown, for the lineage of the gnomes were proud and tall, and their shadows covered men, and the cleverness of their hands wrought boons with steadfastness as the turning of the continents. In those days were the hills of all the world overladen with countless store of gem and gold and other unnamed and mystical things, which the dark elves eagerly sought after in restless years, hidden from starlight. For then were the kingdoms of gnomes free of fear and dragon flay. Never yet did they toil beneath the shadow of Urzagon, as did their children's children, their children's children's children, in fetters of cruel steel. Nor yet were their backs bent from hard hours of toil and labor, fueled by the curse of their greed. With their devices and tools could they dig and delve yet deeper into the hollows of the hills, with no fear or fright that perchance they should disturb some matchless doom in the deep. The gnomes loved most of all gold, pure, orate, and white. Many were the chalices, plates, ornamental headdresses, necklaces, bracelets, diadems, and rings, and musical instruments they wrought. Of these gladly bore they many works to Mythilian, for there was great love between them, for they longed to see their treasures done justice upon a portrait of true beauty. Amongst the kingdoms of the gnomes, Fiandos stood as a prince among kings, the mightiest in stature and the wisest among them. The cities he carved of mountain stone were vast, with halls wide like open leaves, and ceilings softly like open sky, studded with many a precious gem, insomuch that to whomsoever walked therein it would seem to be the open sky illuminated with all the brilliance of the heavens. Hence there were none among the Phaean princes of old whom bestowed greater gifts and hoards of treasure to lay at the feet of Elfand. Behold, Fiandos is the mighty Dane of Fond-du-Land, and his sons the princes of 1,000 hills, the princes of 1,000 hills, so that those whom beheld the treasures of his kingdom and the gifts of favor to that sylvan queen should gaze with sparkled eyes, even the meager and modest trinkets among them. Of all the sons of Fiandos, Nandos is the most renowned. He shaped the stone beneath the great hills of Gilgarad, and built that fabled city Mithridat from the treasures thereof. For a brief time even, long before moonlight first painted the peaks of that region, he set himself a throne upon the crown of maidens, so that he might behold the world and the wonders thereof. Howbeit, Nandos had a restless heart, and came to and fro more oft than his father or his kinsmen. He loved most to see the awe upon the faces of the elves when he shewed his wondrous gifts to them. But more so he delighted to tantalize the ears of the elves, and fill the courts of Glintwaloth with a wealth of tales, lores, and myths, even tales of things pertaining to the gods, and treasures not meant for men. Perhaps his words, more than any other, stirred the hearts of the elves to hoard such great treasures, and love them with a great love akin to the gem lust which the gnomes filled in their own hearts. The lust is but a strong desire, a cupidity for crafted beauty, and there are none whom had loves of starlight turned stone like the gnomes, save the dark elves. Thence it is that Nandos, above all the Fae of old, gave gift of gem the treasure bedaubed. Of the fairies and fays who went to and fro from that wood, the dryads and nymphs, sylphs and sylphs, the sprites and winged things, and all the fey and lords and princesses, the unicorn, or the most fabled. They were servants of the Elmerith, and the principal instruments of musical chord in that age when they lived among men, and they possessed a magic which has often been mistaken as furtive in design rather than elegantly subtle. But this is the common mistake of men to make, not of elves. By reason of their favor upon Elfand, for in the days of Ford, before Eudora stole her heart, she sat upon the shores of Nagan and harped to their voices. Did their presence and their song always grace the courts and terraces of Glentrelaw? The grace and skill of their song and the harmony of them is legend in all the realms of Elfand. Even in the plainness of their speech, in words pour forth with the gentleness of dawn. There is no garble in them, but the reveries of their voices are benumbing. Marked symphonies, each word spoken, a masterpiece of music. The chief choir lofts were reserved for them, those lofts of rainbow-laden waterfalls, of thin, mist-like, sacred pools of dew gathered upon the tightened buds of mauve and green. Here would the unicorns sing, for all Mythilian's hosts, their voices ever prevail, and the noise thereof is the emblem of that age. Though there are none now who can recall, or even grotesquely mimic it. Thus of a truth and verity, it can be surmised indeed that more than the gifts of the gnomes and fairy of the west, and more than the forest majesty of the dark elves, was the presence of the unicorn which befamed Lorn in those days. Now of the unicorn, which lingered oft in Lorn in the halls of Glentrelaw, Muthimir was most beloved, and his bride Nethelfin, whom never left his side. For it is a truth that unicorns have always dwelt in twos, bride and bridegroom. Also of a true delight was Minthial the golden maid. His mane flowed golden as though the sand of Lufon colored his hair. Yet Minthial had a coat as white as pearls in the snow, and yet as purely bright as the crown of Fondalon, glistening in the timeless sky. Many there were who loved and favored his ballad most of all, and Finor was his nearest kin. The Lord of the Unicorns is Mehior by name. He is most belauded among the songs of the elves. Mehior held a great love for the dark elves and their woodland leas. At such times, in which he did bless that kingdom by making merry in the courts of Glentrelaw, all whom dwelt therein rejoiced with much gladness and fervor. Such is the rare celestine power of his song, the dark elves surely would have proffered every priceless treasure and splendor to hear the music of his voice. Those were days of which none in all the world of old should dare to depart from. For there was surely not a voice, nay, not even of the queens of the sylphs, so pure in strands of joy and melodic skill as that of Mehior. No voice since has overcome that of Mehior, be it for voice or plain in words and sound. There is indeed no vein of vibrant note so clear and unrefrained ever broke from silence upon the dawn or death of worlds. For like a mallet to shadow brittle sheets of night, such a vocal chord perhaps found Minroth quaking in his tower. Yet let us not forget that the dark elves themselves boasted many a renowned bard and minstrel, so that the choirs of those halls ever rang out mightily. Perhaps the number of them surmounted the guests and those whom dwelt thereby. There were pipers and harpers and flutists whom played on instruments finely crafted by fay and elf alike. Their instruments shined as brass, polished and brazen, dipped in starfire. The harpers strummed with graceful delicateness, as though they played on strands of silk, and starlight streaked between the morning and evening mist. So it is, no music in all the world is so famed amongst the elves as that of Lorn, and that which cometh from the choirs of Glyn Pullah. Where else in all the world of men and elves have the unicorn come and sang together in unison, save but upon the dawning of the world, and that grievous day when the moon's wet? Nay, there is none to rival it, save perhaps that which rose in blissful melody upon the shoals of Doff Lemore. But those fellows were minstrels to the gods. Their songs have descended upon the shores of the world when the mist is drawn, whene'er the mist is drawn from the sea. Nonetheless, Elafil is boasted as the favorite of Angwil, and with the golden and opal harp Leifei, played on silver strings plucked from the mane of Mehior, did she daily fill those halls with praise. And hers was music of the old world, that of the fairies and the nymphs, and of songs no less sweetly played, as though Maithrin Voss had burst open and flowed before them all. And of a truth has there been none whose hands have played the bow, played the bow as skillfully as a harp, save perhaps Aephilos. Howbeit she was a maiden and of the lineage of men, and thus not held in the high esteem of Elfand. For here is a tale of the elves, cannot speak in particular. For was not Aephilos a maiden of Galanoth? And of all the kingdoms of men, is theirs least remembered, though often well spoken of. For did not the wrath of Minroth come swiftly upon them, when first he made his war with men? Thus it is the splendor and glory and the lay of Lorn and the might of its kingdom, insomuch that the elves of those regions, numbered in the thousands, and even the thousands of thousands, they prospered and were blessed. Many were their craftsmen who were skilled in fashioning devices of archery and instruments of music, flutes and pipes, harps and mandolins, and the gardens of Lorn flourished with the most exotic of flowers and shrubs, insomuch that Angwil herself would surely have flustered to walk among them and to breathe in the many pleasant scents of their delicate and silky petals. By reason of these things, the hearts of the elves grew fat with joy, and filled with honey and wine, insomuch that there was never a whisper, nor yet even a mischievous spirit, who dared to think the days of Aephilos should come to end. Howbeit Elafil kept silent the gift of her foresight. What things were spoken once would she not dare to utter again, for fear she may yet bring a darker charm upon her beloved, or yet her beloved's children. Nevertheless, Eudorus remembered well the words of Elafil, and it pleased him well to see his children grow strong and wise. For all of them did he teach in the way of the bow, and their learning was mighty indeed. Careful was the craftsmanship of Grey Fay. It were of a truth the mightiest of all gifts given by Mindar to the children, to the elves of Lorn. The wisdom of that tool, well esteemed, even farther in the east in days anon, long strove Eudorus in the mastering of that device, though he possessed a natural talent for it. Thence it came to pass that not only did the children of those beloved fairy, Eudorus and Elafil, grow in number and stature, but as well did the shadow of their kingdom encompass all the woods of the Mithlond laurels, and even farther west to the very edges of Daglisson. For yet were there fairy and Daglisson whose hearts were softly turned towards them. Thus it was that among the Faean kingdoms of that age, none encompassed so vast land than that of the Mithlond lores, save for that of Mithlerian Vold. Though yet the glory of Mithlerian Vold is rarely spoken of by the elves, for they are named as a secret sect of the fairy. From then come all the children of nymphs and dryads and the sprites and princesses of the woods. Howbeit, long has it been ere since they fled, before yet even the dark shadow, or before yet even the brow of Minroth hath turned his desire toward the west. And some say all the subjects of that lake partook upon a great exodus, upon the dawn of Asael, when it was that the last days of Visfulnas faded, and the glory of the Elmar last departed the world of elves and men. Howbeit, there were those who yet remained, wild are they and fearful of men, though still do they have a love of the elves. Howbeit, before the days of the fall of Narndil, few indeed of the children of Mindar roamed so far west, or even espied the shores of Nadruin. Now in those days the western region of Elfand became the heart and throne of that kingdom. Henceforth the kingdom of the dark elves came to be called Lorn, for its borders were vast, and the memories and songs of its children as strong and sweet as the very heart of those woods. As aforesaid, it had come to pass that the love of Elafil and Eudorus brought forth many children, 7 sons and 5 daughters, all of whom were nobles and damsels of great renown, and skill of elfin song and device throughout all the lands of the fairy and all the kingdoms of elves, so that the fame of their children grew in name and fable, even beyond the farthest borders of the fairy, and all those regions, namely Mithleri and Vold, whose borders encompassed just nigh the entire world, from east to west, and from north to south, save that of those vast desert regions in the north. The 7 sons of Eudorus were Mithilos, Minar, Lingal, Aphilos, Phaethio, Mystalos, and Tuwith. Tuwith was the youngest, and Mithilos the firstborn. Of 5 daughters born unto Elafil did she name Enel, Linthorwith, Gwynthil, Amberlin, and Eonlily. And Aeon was the eldest among her sisters, and Amberlin was yet the youngest of all their children, both sons and daughters. Some have said Amberlin was the fairest of them all, and held a beauty equal to that of her mother. Alas, no poems are written to praise her loveliness, for in a day of sadness did she hide her beauty in a veil, and thence refused to love. Albeit those who knew her best say her heart was tender, and yet more so than all the lilies after rain, for it was the love she kept from man which made her so. And thus no lineage came to her. Now from her mother learned she the secrets of the heart, insomuch that when at last Elafil passed from the world of elves and men, she gave to Eonlily her heart, Leolfay, for she loved Amberlin dearly, and Eonlily's heart was grieved indeed in that day, for among sisters were those 2 closest. And was not that harp ever by her side, till again her mother's face was seen? But the voices of all Elafil's daughters resounded, resplendent, insomuch that they oft sang in the choirs of Limtoloth, while standing beside the sacred fairy. Though some say Eonlily had the purest voice among them, and Mehur surely favored it. Now amongst all the elves of Lorn, both past and present, and privily from the house of Eondul, that is the lineage of Eudoros, there may be none so well esteemed as Mithilos, the firstborn of the king. For these days, which have been called Visfulnas, revolve around Mithilos and his deeds, and those whom were his acquaintances, both friend and foe. Mithilos being the king's son, and the eldest had many acquaintances, of course, his brother Minar and his sister Amberlin being his nearest among his own kin. However, there was one fellow in particular, a bard, not of Lorn, whom he had a most unusual friendship with. Thus stated unusual, for there were not many of Lorn whom kept such company with the elves of the East in those days, though not by reason of rapport, for the elves of the East and of the West were far from one another geographically, and Eudorus and Morandi were indeed brothers. Of all the elves in those days, was there none whose bands were so tightly drawn in friendship among the unicorn, save for that of Ymegil, a wood elf of that realm, and his fame as a bard reached well beyond the realms of the elves, so that they began to call him a minstrel, for Lorn knew many bards. E'er since that day, when Eudorus befriended Mutabir on the shores of Illuvius, fairy and fay hath been kindred spirits. Thus did the friendship of the unicorn and the children of Eudorus grow in strength with the passing of each timeless and unmeasured year. Their bonds of kindredness grew in so much that there dwelt not one sweet-spirited elf in all the woodland realm of Lore, which held no small measure of affection for at least one of Mehior's many kin, nor knew those fellows by name. Yet all elves, and even the singers and musicians in the halls of Glen-Twilloth, there was yet one, Ymegil, an elf of no meager skill, whose talent surpassed all others. He possessed a fervent love for the flute, for the music of its lute was to him as the laughter of the breeze betwixt the never-fading bowers of Angwell's gardens. And if a green summer field, laden with dew, twinkled like jasper between a starry sky, such was the joy in his eyes when he played the flute. The flute of Ymegil is called an esmal pipe. Such was the design of this device that it was composed of 3 long shafts of differing length, and many were the notes it could play both high and low, and the esmal pipe required a great skill in the playing of it. Now the esmal is an instrument of the fairy, and none there are of men who have heard or seen its power of song, save perhaps the wild men in ranges of Urinor, who dare to walk nearby the shadows of Lorlis in the south, and perchance have heard a distant echo of the esmal bay upon the low wisps of the wind, for the memory of its tune is now the haunt of Lorlis. However, Ymegil did not care much for the courts of Glen-Twilloth, though they were yet ever filled with praise and much gaiety. Rather, he loved the solitude of the thick oak, and namely the elms, which grew more abundant in the west, and even nigh the roots of Azurfant. There would he roam without care or thought or even certainty of way, rarely then returning to Mythiliand in the green courts of Glen-Twilloth, though Eudorus missed his presence, and long implored him to linger there and to make merry in the courts. For the lyric of Ymegil's flute was of a rare kind, and of the elves few have yet learned its skill, for it was a device known mostly to the nymphs. When then the esmal pipe of Ymegil was played alongside the clear voice of Mehior, and with the golden harp of Elfand, and the melody of her lips blending within, then there was not a choir in all the elfin lands so enchanting to be heard. Such a ballad could not be bared by even the Eldar in those days, for its magic was powerful and would steal away even the strongest of men's spirits. Eudorus loved this ballad above all, save the solitary voice of his beloved. Thus did he ever implore that bard to linger. The first days of Vala, which is to say, the beginning of the new year, were drawing nigh. Soon would come Mehior again to the courts of Glen-Twilloth, with all his host from Lintar, elves and fairy, always enjoying a great many days feasting and singing in celebration of Angwell's blessings. On the first of each new year, would such occasion be made, it was ever the custom of the nymphs, and at the bidding of Elfand, and the elves of Lorn had adopted the celebration. For the elves and for the fairy of Mithlerian Vold, there was not a day of greater joy nor rejoicing. All who walked the world knew that day. For this cause had Eudorus sought that minstrel, if none other than on the least this day alone, would he hope to have the pipe of Ymegrill complete the choir. Yet none were there of Ymegril's kin who knew whither he might be, save that the echo of his flute had been heard upon the hills in the east, or yet glimpsed as rays of star fading in the west across the leaves. For he was well adept at keeping his solitude. Among all the elves was there no such fellow, as much of a rouse to gad about as he. Thence, more often than not, when his flute was desired, it had to be sought. Though the elves knew little of where Ymegrill the bard might be, found wandering or lingering with low of lute and muse, some there were of fay and fairy who knew well. For oft would Ymegrill speak to the unicorn and the nymphs, and of these, namely Gwenfithamus, for she was the daughter of Melchior, insomuch that if that bard's talent for song was great and favored among elves, so much the more was his love and his fellowship with the daughter of Melchior. Her white coat seemed as the foam of the sea, and her spiral shone as silver gray. She was yet his common companion. Many hymns shared they beneath the twilight bowers of morn, and many sweet memories of honeysuckle wine. She was to him as a sister and a kindred companion, and Ymegrill loved her with a great love. Through her friendship, did the skill of Ymegril's lute grow insomuch that when he piped, all who heard awed in wordless praise. Many would weep, and some many tears, for the songs of Ymegrill were true and pure, and joy would fill the hearts of listening ears. So some have said that oftentimes when Ymegrill wandered alone beneath the wood and stars with none save Gwenfithamus, that Dryden would come and Fingal too, and take the forms of men. Then was Ymegrill drawn to them, for he heard their sound from afar as one who perceives the subtle change of nature in the midst of no change. With pipe in hand would he draw nigh to where they appeared, and they declared to him, "This is the noise which ye have heard, for we are come up from thence rejoicing." And they would beseech of him a song. It seemed a small thing to the wood elf that these Titans should look upon him. None the less, that they might come and find beauty and pleasure in the playing of his pipe, made him tremble. He was quick to bow to them and to say, "My lords, such an honor is not mine, but I pray my music finds thee feel." And Ymegrill would pipe for them. Though yet their presence was great, and the wind bowed before Dryden, and the music of the spheres shy before Fingal, and the rivers ran quiet. Though if such a tale was true, it came not from the lips of Ymegrill, for he did not boast of such things, and so some have called him shy, and others modest, for never, even in those days, were elves wont to keep company with Titans. Now some have said that the spirit of Dryden was in Ymegrill, for it was he relished the gentle rush of the wind and the soft shrill call of Dryden's lute. He was wont to imitate such chords upon his flute. Oft then would he sit beneath the shade of a solitary elm with Gwenfithamus at his side, and he would play for her epic melodies upon that flute, and she would sing with the voice of gladness and the voice of laughter. Ever thus would they roam carefree. Howbeit Ymegrill favored most regions of the west, very near the roots of Azurfant. Azurfant is a region of low-lying hills, beside which lay the lake Wapan. The borders were drawn from the top of the hill unto the fountains of water there on the shores of the lake. In those days were there great elm and beech trees, which stood proudly against the shadow of those low-lying mountains. Gwenfithamus loved to prance there whene'er he piped. A wide field of grassland lay betwixt Lorn and Daglisson, and this plain was her delight. With Ymegrill upon her back, yet playing his flute as she galloped, they named those meadows Moongreen, by reason of the light which fell upon them. For on the western end of that greensward lay a still lagoon, sleepy and stirless, and a stream whose name is now forgotten. Those watchers magnified the light of the moon, so that there was light enough for moonflowers were found there. Howbeit, the west was not their only love. Yea, they roamed at times in the east along the banks of the Don and through the daywood of Lorn, till coming at last upon the first rises of Vain and Nerve and the south-flowing river of Eressa, there lay the great vale of Lillifond, and it was a long valley tucked betwixt the great mountains, insomuch that many have called it the heart of Elfand, when Frithmus could long prance there. Lillifond was an abode of celestial face, for at times when they wandered thereupon did they espy the glorious Sepulchre, descending to and from the heavens, as it were on stairs of mist and vesper. Now the elves claim those prairies too once knew the presence of some mythical kin of the unicorns, hoofed beings, with silver sprinkled wings, horses of a sort, which pranced upon the wind and clouds and spoke in unknown tongues. On occasion it would come into the heart and desire of Ymegil to wander the eastern woods of Vaon, and if his mood was all the more mischievous, even among the elves of Nondolium, for that was the city of silver bells. 'Tis the fair city of 1,000 falls, and yet 10,000 cascades. The rivers of Yelmwind and Bloomer flowed about it, and the music of Merle Nos filled it ever. Hence did Ymegil please himself to linger at sundry times in that place, and yet among those people. And secretly the bard envied how the tresses of those elves shone so silver and golden, whereas all the elves of Lorn were adorned with crowns of midnight. As the elves of Lorn were famed for their skill of lute and laud, the elves of the east are yet most renowned for the elegance of their words. Skillful are they in the composition of verse and eulogy, and as it hath been said of old, words fitly spoken are like apples of gold in pictures of silver. In the days of Aethelwulf, Silthanel was most renowned, and Lithwin the flutist. A great skill had he in the way of poetry, so that Ymegil loved his words, for he was well adept in finding words to Ymegil's hymns, though yet Ymegil himself could not hardly do so. But perhaps Silthanel is remembered well, for he is the father of Orthinia. Ymegil had come again into the east, and not without good Frithmus. Therefore had Eudorus and all of Lorn supposed, and sought him upon the hills of laughter, being late for him. Further west had they called, but heard not his name, even beyond the grasslands of Vel, for the lee sprites and unicorn of that region said, he has not piped here of late. Now that bard was mindful of the festivals of the elves, and the days of Ongul's hand, the spring solace. That hour drew nigh, and the festivals of glee. Aye, he loved those days sorely, and he loved greater still to stand amidst the host of Lorn and behold how his lute might bring glee to the eyes of the elves. Always did he heed the call of Eudorus to come and join in those choirs. None the less, he abode now in Narndil, and in the blessed company of Silthanel the poet. Beneath the vibrant vesper and moon glow did the leaves of the east seem now more verdantly endowed than aforetimes. He cared not to return hither and spend days which now should be spent composing ballads to the rhymes of Narn's great bard. For he so loved the smile of Gwenfithimus when first she would hear a newly composed song, and Ymegil had yet many new songs for her, which Silthanel should easily put to words. And so it came to pass, a burden arose in the heart of the king of the dark elves, and he tarried alone in Glen Twaloth, ruminating upon his throne, though none besides filled the halls with sound or song. Now lo, thither in the woods spake an elf amongst the throng, saying, whither is the king? Shall he tarry forever in solitude, whilst we all rise up to play? Let us go thither and fetch him. And they went thither to the halls of birch, and found King Eudorus sitting upon his wooden throne. And as they drew nigh the steps of the dais, he lifted up his head from thought with a sigh, and they said to him, "What is the burden of the Lord, in that he would not frolic with them in the woods?" And he answered them, "What burden?" As he spake, his shadow withdrew in the starlight of the trees. "Bring me a vessel." And one of the damsels of the court brought him an urn of willow ware, filled to the brim with water from the river Dal. She poured him a cup, and as he took it, he said to the elves which stood before him, "Alas, the whole earth is at rest and is quiet. The flowers appear on the earth, a time of singing of birds is come, and the voice of the turtle is heard in our land. And yet gladness is taken from my heart, for I have no minstrel to pipe for me." Then the elfin damsel turned and poured water into the cups of those elves whom had come to inquire of the king. And as they drank, the boldest among them beckoned of the king to come and carouse with them in the grasses of the forest. But the king waved his hand, and with a shaking of his head he said, "Nay, Vala draweth nigh. Shall our joy be minified?" And to those words all in the king's court expected him to arise and rejoice. For all of Lorn 'twas astir in its labors of joy. Laboring for joy for a new year is a new thing in the earth. If a new day be a new thing, how much more a new year, and the first day the most vernal day of such, when it arises. The king did not arise, the king did not rejoice. He kept his solemn state until they had perceived what seemed to them to be a strangely candid reservation of gladness. Then spake he to all within the court, saying, "Like pipes, and my heart shall sound like pipes, because the riches of Lorn are perished to me. They are become as bereaved and shorn ornaments of vain boasting, though all the elves pipe with pipes, though all the branches of the oaks shake themselves against such piping. For who amongst ye hath a pipe prepared? 'Tis it not gleed for which we now await?" Then an elf among the throng said, "Would that someone would pipe for him, for surely he desireth a minstrel." "Now bring me a minstrel, and let the damsels rejoice in the dance," beckoned the king. Then King Eudorus acknowledged the elf that had spake, and afterward there was brought a piper with a pipe, and he piped for them. And the tune of his pipe was as the sound of the turtle, for of such had the king spoken. And the tune of the elf's pipe was as the tune of the oaks, for the song of the oaks of Lorn held sway in the joy of the elves' hearts. The turtle and the oak, and the song thereof played. Now the song of the turtle is the song of small things, which go forth slowly, yet gracefully. And the sound of the oak is the sound of strength which cannot be moved, for it resteth beside the still waters, the waters of pellucid streams, streams of nourishment, whose trickle is over polished stones. The elves piped, the damsels danced. When they had made an end to their ballad and ballet, the dark elf king remained still with solemn composure and a restrained twinkle in his eye. "Would that there was engraved upon my heart, would that there was engraving upon my heart," hearkened the king. For hearken had he indeed to the pipe and the dance and the song of the turtle and the oak. Then praised he them with much thanks. Yet the elves perceived their king had not rejoiced with auspicious bedaub, nor arisen from his throne in revels of rejoicing. Then said an elf to the king, "Are we not elves?" "Aye," the king replied, but none durst pipe after that. And so the starlight fell and cast its glitter upon the shadows of the court, insomuch that the throne of the king seemed to shimmer as though wrought not of wood, but of precious stone. Then Eudorus confessed to them, "Oh, woe, alas, that Imogen wert here among us. Then should there be joy. said the king, looking to those whom had entered the court, smiling ironically, offering to them his open hand. And they knew he spake of Emegil the minstrel. Where shall a minstrel be found? For Emegil is not among us, they said one to another. Therefore the king commanded that his son Mythilos should be brought unto him, for he knew that there was none among the elves there who should travel so far as the east in the days of the month of the end of the year, for such a matter, for such a burden, as the burden of the king of the dark elves, to whom would a king with a king's burden cast his weighty care, and his care of joy, save his eldest son, Mythilos? This is Lore, and these are the dark elves. Theirs is a grace, measured, numbered, and counted, not as men or gnomes might surmount in cupidity and wealth. Rather, they are beseechers of joy and gladness. Their cupidity is in their revelry and their verdant requiems. To dream of verdancy and the verdesque is to dream of new things created in the earth, things of quality and things of perfection. For a perfect work is the work of the unseen hand. Sometimes by and by a glimpse is caught, though briefly of such. It passes by in the law and grace horizons of sea and land, of sound and music. For the dark elves, 'tis music which enthralls them, the music of spring, the sound of the trees, the sound of eternal youth. There are no elves amongst the folds of Lorne whom lack in such skill, for they play with harp and lyre, mandolin and pipe, bandolier and timbrel, and even drum. But who might paint a requiem of sound, formed first in thought and heart, then outlined with the silhouette of tree, till at last, becoming its intended garnishment, to indulge all joy upon the ear, and trembling therein reach the soul. Therefore, there 'twas no regret in the gratitude of the king for the piping of the elves. Yet among the elves, as aforenamed, there is one whom pipes as others cannot, Emegil. The king quiesced to his former posture, sitting more reposed upon his wooden throne. He looked up at the stars, which seemed always particularly bright and shining. Once again, his shadow cast a long and flower-like haunt across the dais, and as he scratched his chin and thought upon this dilemma, his obvious and sure recourse came to mind. Ah, Mythilos, he thought, and his eyes brightened with cheer, for there was confidence and love, too, in that name. His heart could rest easy knowing that Vala and the days of glee would have no lack, for the day was Mythanol the first, and this is the first day of the last month of the year. There was time enough to fetch that minstrel. And so went forth the desire of the king. Call forth Mythilos to me. Bring me a minstrel.